Hello, and welcome to a very festive episode of Lucky Crit. And today, before we get started here, I just want to make a little bit of an addendum to the last episode where we focused on the Jagan archetype. And in that video, I mentioned that it was debated as to whether or not Ifas were their own archetype or just a sub-archetype of the Jagans. But I didn't really mention or play devil's advocate for those that feel that Ifas are still just Jagans, and they're just a singular Jagan archetype that encompasses them all. And this is a fair point of view. Though some are better than others, and not all Jagans are created equally, they all serve a similar role and can be very useful and good at what they do, good growths and bases or not. It all comes down to personal experience as to the longevity of these units and just how useful they'll be in each person's playthrough, so naturally even when I talked about how some have better stats than others, or how some tend to fall off faster, of course there were a lot of you out there that had different experiences where some of the Jagans that you used turned out a lot better and more useful than perhaps I gave them credit for. So it's very fair to consider that all Ifas are just Jagans, just with a little bit of variation throughout the series. Perhaps this is something that we could touch upon further in another video, but for now, onto the main topic. Originally in Fire Emblem, archetypes were just unit trends that players had noticed, and sort of tongue-in-cheek throwbacks to older characters, sprinkled in by developers. And many of these archetypes and recurring units that we'll be speaking about in this series were actually named and classified by the real players, not the developers. And as far as we knew, they didn't actually consider archetypes a real concept in the series until they officially recognized them in the 2010 Fire Emblem Arcania Chronicle Memorial book that featured pages dedicated to all of the official archetypes. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any images or further info on these pages, but at least we now know that there is actually something more to these character trends, and developers do actually consider these templates while making the games in the series. So archetypes are actually official, or at least some of them are. And for today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the famous Christmas Cavalier Cain and Abel archetype. The Cain and Abel duo Cavalier archetype began in the original 1990 NES game, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Cain and Abel were two early game Cavaliers that Marth recruited into his army, and served as sort of his initial right-hand men alongside Jagan. This archetype is defined usually by two Cavaliers who tend to have some personal history from before the events of the main story in each game, and typically both don red and green armor. Generally speaking, the red-armored one tends to be a bit more serious personality-wise, and their growths tend to focus on HP, skill, and defense. And the green-armored one tends to be a little bit more laid-back personality-wise, with better strength and luck growths. One also won't typically have higher strength and speed growths than the other, as it tends to be one that gets more speed and one that gets more strength. Though, like I've said before, this isn't always the case, and there's some pretty nice variation and a whole lot of flip-flopping at times, as you'll see, which makes things a bit more interesting and causes the colors to represent different stats throughout the series. Examples of characters within this archetype would obviously be Cain and Abel, the original duo who served prominent roles in Fire Emblem 1, 11, 3, and 12, and in Fire Emblem 1, Cain had higher HP, skill, speed, and luck growths than Abel, while Abel had higher strength and weapon level growths. And Cain had higher strength and luck bases, while Abel had higher skill, speed, and weapon level bases. But now with Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon for the DS, they've been a little bit more rounded out. Cain has higher HP and luck growths, and Abel just has a higher strength growth, but they're pretty comparable. And they also maintain the same base stats that they excel at in the original. Jumping into Fire Emblem 2, Fire Emblem Gaiden, and its remake, Fire Emblem Echoes, which serves as the 15th entry in the series, we have Lukas and Forsyth, who aren't Cavaliers but are soldier units, donning the correct colors and similarities to continue the archetype into Fire Emblem Gaiden and Echoes, and they serve as the Cain and Abel of Almsrue.
Worse surprises than this await us all. Is everyone ready?
Lukas has higher HP, skill, and defense growths, while Forsyth has higher attack, speed, luck, and resistance. Base stats wise, Forsyth is recruited 2 levels higher than Lukas, and comes with higher HP and much better base resistance. This is pretty consistently what we see most units in these archetypes having for growth rates, although the strength or attack growths as well as the speed can definitely switch back and forth and vary between the games. For any units that get recruited at higher levels, I won't be doing a full base stat comparison, just visually showing that they do indeed come at the higher level, as it can be pretty subjective to determine if units that come later do actually have better bases due to the time of recruitment as well as other factors, and that would require a deeper dive into a lot of the games in the series, and that isn't really the point of this video, so I'll be leaving that part out, and you can make your own determinations as to whose bases are better in these cases. And although Boey's original artwork was kind of all over the place in terms of his color scheme, he and Mae are definitely what I would consider to be another set of Gaiden and Echoes, Cains and Abels, this time representing Celica's route. Mae and Boey are also a bit of a switch up this time around, with Boey focusing on the normally red skills and Mae focusing on the green ones, as well as having the higher attack and speed at the cost of her bulk. Mae's growths favor attack, speed, and luck, while Boey's growths favor higher HP, skill, and defense. this resulting in Boey being the more tanky and slow mage, while Mae is the more frail but speedy one. Base stats wise, Mae starts off much faster and with higher res and an extra point of attack, Boey with more HP, skill, much higher luck, and more defense. Their bases tend to echo their growth rates. Jumping to Fire Emblem 3 and its remake, Fire Emblem 12, New Mystery of the Emblem, we've got Luke and Roderick, or Rhodey, who serve the more archetypal Cain and Abel roles. But things are a bit different this time around in the sense that there's also a third Cavalier that you get pretty early on, Cecile, and she's the one wearing the red armor. Go figure. This time around, Luke's growths focus more on HP and strength, and Rhodey's growths focus more on skill, speed, and luck. And base stats wise, Rhodey starts off with higher luck, but Luke has extra points of strength, speed, and defense. In Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War, we've got Noish and Alec. Joining Sigurd early on as some of the Knights of Chalfie, these guys definitely continue the Cain and Abel spirit, and are pretty similar to how Luke and Rhodey were. Noish has the higher HP, strength, and defense growths, and Alec has more skill, speed, and luck. Fire Emblem 5, Thracia 776, is a little bit more questionable, with the likes of Alva and Cain. Yes, another Cain. And while they do tend to fit the archetype, I do know, thanks to the Fire Emblem Wiki, that they were in fact left out of the Arcania Chronicle Cain and Abel page, so who knows. Looking at them really quickly, this Cain has higher HP, strength, defense, and constitution, and Alva has higher magic, skill, speed, and luck growths, so this one's a bit of a mix-up too. Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade, brought us Alan and Lance, with Alan having higher HP, strength, luck, and defense, and Lance having higher skill, speed, and res. A little bit of a switch up with the red getting the luck this time around, but things are pretty consistent still. As a lot of you may remember, in Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade, we were introduced to Kent and Sain, who follow the archetype pretty closely. Kent having a bit more HP and speed, and focusing a lot more on skill and defense growths, while Sain has the higher strength and luck growths. In Fire Emblem 8, The Sacred Stones, Ephraim had his boys Forde and Kyle, Forde with higher skill, speed, luck, and res, and Kyle having higher HP, strength, and defense. So this is also another switch up here, with Forde tending to have the more green skills and Kyle having the red skills. Fire Emblem 9, Path of Radiance, brought us Kieran and Oscar, with Kieran having better HP, strength, and defense, and Oscar having better magic, speed, and luck. With Fire Emblem 10 being a sequel, and 11 and 12 being remakes like I mentioned earlier, Fire Emblem 13, Awakening, brought us Sully and Stahl. Sully brings to the table higher magic, skill, speed, luck, and res growths, with Stahl having higher HP, strength, and defense growths. Once again, a little bit of a switch up, with the green tending to have the red skills, and the red tending to have the green skills. And their bases also tend to match this trend as well. Fire Emblem 14, Fire Emblem Fates, brought us Saizo and Kaze, who while being the ninja class, fulfill the other aspects of this archetype, and are essentially just a playful variation this time around for the birthright route. Saizo focuses on strength, magic, skill, luck, and defense, while Kaze focuses on HP, speed, resistance, and a much worse 0% magic growth when compared to Saizo's 45%. And that catches us up, considering Fire Emblem 15, Fire Emblem Echoes, is another remake, and we already talked about those characters. However, the Cain and Abel archetype is also present in the Fire Emblem spin-off, Tokyo Mirage Sessions, Sharp FE, and albeit strange in appearance, are definitely still continuing the archetype. So that's that. Here are all the Christmas Cavaliers, and I'm sure we'll be seeing some more in the days ahead. They serve as a real sort of series staple that I just can't imagine being without. Fire Emblem has always been about choice, which stats to prioritize above others, which unit is more successful in their stat distributions, and characters in this archetype are a really fun way of showcasing the different ways of playing and different kinds of characters to get a feel for. And it's also a great way to make fun of your friends when they pick the wrong color, because obviously the best color is... Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you all have a fantastic holiday season this year. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Also be sure to leave me a comment and let me know which color you tend to prioritize, or if it's different throughout the different games, or if you want to leave me essays about certain characters' stats and their growths and everything because you want to correct me, then go ahead. But also let me know which characters that you tend to prefer overall throughout the entire series. I know obviously they flip-flop back and forth, but it's pretty interesting to think about, and I'd like to see, you know, if there's a more popular color than the other color, and so on and so forth. So definitely be sure to let me know. Once again, a huge shout out to all of our patrons who help make content like this possible and continue to support the channel even through some of the hard times of YouTube demonetization, and also Nintendo uploading a lot of the Fire Emblem Heroes music to YouTube, which means that now a lot of your favorite Fire Emblem YouTubers are probably going to have a lot of their music tracks claimed, and all that money no longer going to them, which is pretty terrible, honestly. So if you start hearing stock music in Fire Emblem videos from this point on, you'll know why. Anyway, also make sure to join us over on our Discord server for even more discussion beyond this video, and we tend to have a pretty good time hanging out in there, so be sure to stop by. And I haven't shamelessly plugged our merch in a little while, so if you're looking for any new additions to your wardrobe, definitely be sure to check out our Spreadshirt. You can also follow us on Twitter at Lucky Crit Gaming for any updates, news, and also memes that we share, because, you know, memes are pretty cool, right? Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.